So, hello everyone. It's a great pleasure for us to be here with you today, again on the invite of the Genealogical Society. And today we'll briefly introduce you to the context of the 1946 general elections in Czechoslovakia that then went on to shape the destiny of the country for over 4 decades. We'll do this in such a way so that you can relate to what was going on in the country at the time, and perhaps you can better understand and appreciate what happened 2 years later when the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia took over power in the country. To begin with, we have to realize that 1946 was just a year after the greatest armed conflict in history really rocked Europe and the world, and Czechoslovakia too. This is when great battles took place. And after the war, after the initial jubilation and celebrations were over, the grim reality set in. When people returned to destroyed towns and cities, and there were dead bodies lying around in forests and in the streets. The economy was on its knees, and people had the first-hand lived experience of the great trauma that the Second World War inflicted on them. And it was not just the Second World War, it was also the First World War that came just 20 years before the second one. So some of these people have lived through and experienced two destructive wars. So when the second one was over, it was not just about celebrating. It really set on this heaviness and the fear and the confusion of the people, as well as a lot of disenchantment.
So as Dr. Gabriela mentioned, people were certainly very, very disorientated. They were in a state of shock. Many were suffering from post-traumatic trauma, so PTSD. They came back home, and certainly conditions were very, very rough. And not only were they returning to bombed out infrastructure, there also was a fear for survival in terms of how would they be able to gain access to food. There wasn't enough food in the initial destabilization after the war. So they were very much open to new alternatives, maybe even what some would frame radical new alternatives, and communism and communist ideology was one of them. In fact, before the elapse of the Second World War, Czechoslovakia had the largest communist party following outside of the Soviet Union. So already, even before the arrival of communism into our region, the ideology had already sown its seeds and was very much resonating with the people, especially the working people, which was the prime target, the proletariat. Once communism began to be implemented, there were certain policies or measures that were put into place, and one of them was, of course, getting rid of opposition. Now, you can't just come into a society and remove it of key people. You have to mobilize a certain narrative. So therefore, the narrative that was mobilized by the party was one of threat, and that the party was actually coming in to protect the people. Firstly, the threat was external. The threat was the imperialist West, the bourgeoisie, and the capitalist ways of the past that obviously did not serve the people, did not serve the European people. In fact, it just resulted in death and destruction and loss. Once again, one accumulated death toll of 100 million people if we look at the consequences of both world wars. So first, there was the external threat, but later another narrative was mobilized of the internal threat. And the internal threat were those that were branded as saboteurs or agents of the West that needed to be eradicated from society in order to implement this new ideology, this new ideal, this new way of life, this collective living where the people at the bottom of the hierarchy, the people at the very bottom of the pyramid would once again, or would for the first time ever, not once again, excuse me, first time ever rule. In order to get rid of these saboteurs, certain processes were mobilized, like the show trials, but we're not going to discuss that now. I just want to mention that the key people that had to be purged from the society in order to make way for the establishment of communism, and the first ones were, of course, the political opposition, the Democrats that were actually in parliament holding power, political power. The next wave were the industrialists or the entrepreneurs. Those were the people in the society that were holding the capital power. The third wave was the priest class, which was the religious leadership, the clergy, the priests, the monks, the nuns that were holding the spiritual power in the society. And lastly were the agrarian power holders, which were branded as the kulaks. These were those men and women or families that actually owned substantial chunks of land and led the farming economy of Czechoslovakia. So these are the multiple levels that had to be systematically purged from the society in order to make way for communism.
But let's not skip ahead of the time. Let's return back to the immediate post-war years in Czechoslovakia, where there was a lot of fear among the population, and there was a lot of distrust of the former elites and of the democracy as such, because it failed to protect them from the Second World War. So these people were very vulnerable to these seductive narratives of the Communist Party that promised to protect them. And in 1946 came the general election. And the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia had great ambitions. And justly so. As Zuzana had already elaborated, they had been running these attractive narratives immediately after the war in order to secure the vote, in order to secure the support of the population, because the way the Communist Party wanted to take power over in the country was the plan was for this to be done peacefully, if at all possible. So the general elections of 1946 offered an opportunity to them. And their strategies worked, or specifically they worked in the Czech land, because in these elections, the Communist Party secured 38% of the vote, which made it the strongest political party in Czechoslovakia. But it has to be said that the support of this party was much greater in the Czech part of Czechoslovakia. Slovaks were a lot more hesitant. Here, the rhetoric of the Communist Party didn't work so well for several reasons. First of all, Slovakia was much less industrialized, so a majority of people still worked in agriculture. And to them, the Communist Party did not really have so much to offer with the idea of everybody, owning all the land, for there to be no private ownership, for there to be no sort of individual farmers and farms. So Slovaks didn't like this. That was one reason. The second one was that Slovaks were and still are an overwhelmingly Catholic nation. So this secular ideology, again, did not sit so well with them. And in Slovakia, it was actually the Social Democrats that won the elections. But the way the political system worked, the overall winner was the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, but they weren't strong enough to form a solo government. So they had to enter into a coalition government with the Social Democrats. So that was a bit annoying, but the communists had to just work with what they had. And it did not take long for them to implement all kinds of measures and strategies to subvert democratic structures of Czechoslovakia from within, and to especially weaken the political opposition, or the democratic faction of the government. It was critical to the Communist Party to secure the Ministry of Interior, the leader of the party, Klement Gottwald, was very adamant that it should be his party that would control this important ministry, and so it happened. And as soon as the communists were in their seats and in the power, they started to replace people at key posts within the ministry with loyal supporters of the Communist Party. And this did not just happen centrally. Of course, at first, they had to consolidate their influence in Prague, in the center of Czechoslovakia, but in the second round, they would kind of roll out the policy and the strategy to also include the regions. So there too should have been communists that were in important deciding positions. The Ministry of Interior was so important because it was this ministry that controlled the military, the police, as well as the information agencies, so the intelligence. And the communists, they did have great ideas and ideals and ambitions, and they did want to rule as the sole party. They did want to establish a dictatorship of communism, and for that, this ministry was absolutely critical, so they could prepare the grounds for the big power takeover. In the years after the elections, just to illustrate what happened, the size of the police force doubled compared to the number of policemen Czechoslovakia had in interwar years. The Communist Party also started to organize so-called people's militias. So these were civilians who were drafted into this informal army, which was illegal. It was not approved by any law or any discussion in the parliament. And they started to sort of supplying these people with arms, creating an army that would support the Communist Party if the push came to shove and they had to actually fight for power. So the Communist Party was very busy between 1946 and 1948 preparing the grounds for this big power move. What also happened was that the reporting that would be so omnipresent after 1948 in Czechoslovakia started to go underway. Zuzana already touched upon it. This is when the Communist Party would at first try to persuade the rival Social Democrats to cooperate. They would try to persuade them with bribes, with promising sort of attractive posts and functions, and more power within the system. If that didn't work, they would resort to digging out intelligence material that they could use against their rivals to tarnish their reputation in the eyes of the public. And there would also be threats made to those who were perceived as dangerous. So though these were the politicians that had sway in the public, who were popular, who were very vocal, and who were opposed to the ideas and ideals of communism. In those years, or in 1947, I believe, there were also 3 bombs delivered in mail to 3 ministers. 2 of those reached their target, but they never exploded. And the third one that was intended for Jan Masaryk was a very popular minister of foreign affairs and the son of the founder of Czechoslovakia, Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk. That bomb that was intended for him was sort of caught early on in the mail, so it never got to its destination. And these activities were never properly investigated, really. But given what was going on in Czechoslovakia, it's very likely that it's the Communist Party that was responsible for sort of taking this extreme turn when it came to threatening their opponents and scaring them, and in all ways possible preventing them from speaking up, and from compromising the plan of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia.
Okay, and just a comment on Dr. Gabriela's earlier slide and commentary, to understand that for the Communist Party leadership in Czechoslovakia at the time, they were extremely bold in their moves to consolidate power. Unlike conventional politicians of maybe even today's era, or any that Czechoslovakia had experienced in the past, and that was because they were truly believing that they were leading a world revolution. So they weren't just acting on behalf of Czechoslovakia's geography, but they were part of a greater social movement backed by the Soviet Union that was going to completely bring about a new way of existing on this planet. So it wasn't that they were just acting in their personal interest to gain power, to gain money, or for that of their families, but it was really, really part of a much greater scheme that allowed these people to work so effectively together and so boldly together, and maybe so immorally together, in terms of arming common civilians with artillery, or in terms of taking over the Ministry of Interior so that they can begin establishing their surveillance state to get rid of these so-called saboteurs, which some or many of these individuals actually believed existed. And it was these elements that needed to be eradicated for society in order for communism to truly take over and create this greater world for the greater good of all. Of course, creating this greater world for the greater good of all, was faced with some opposition, and particularly Western model, the democratic capitalist model, that also believed it had the formula to creating a greater world, a more just world, a more abundant world. And this really, this conflict between these two ideologies became very much apparent after the elapse of the Second World War, when the European continent began once again to rebuild. And they viewed the ability to restore the continent as also as a means to spread one's influence, whether that was the communist influence further into Western Europe or into Eastern Europe, and leaking more and more past Central Europe into Austria and Germany, etc., or whether that was the Western democratic model once again spreading into Central Europe and further into Eastern Europe, reclaiming its original territories, because Czechoslovakia was certainly a democratic country before the elapse of the Second World War. So in this case, the American model that was offered to help stabilize Europe was the Marshall Plan. It was the equivalent of $100 billion funding strategy that was mobilized by the US government. So at the time, of course, it was a much lesser sum, but the equivalent of that sum in today's economy is $100 billion. And it was to help to restore the agricultural infrastructure and the industrial backbone of Europe, because Europe, of course, was a very important trade partner to the US. But in lending this money, in America, lending these funds to these European nations, it wasn't just about helping being do-gooder and helping to restore these economies, but of course it was about helping to reaffirm the alliance with democracy, with capitalism, and with the USA, and to prevent these countries from even flirting with the ideals of communism. This Marshall Plan restoration package was, of course, also offered to the Czechoslovak government, and the government was very much interested in this funding. It was a lot of money, it was a lot of cash flow for a deprived post-war economy, but in Moscow's eyes, this was absolutely unacceptable. Stalin saw through this strategy that it wasn't just a goodwill project for the benefit of Czechoslovakia to restore its infrastructure, but rather that it was a coercive move to basically enter Europe and enter, in this case, also Czechoslovakia through the back door, through this exchange of money, in a way taken as a bribe, or certainly indebting Czechoslovakia to the U.S. government, and therefore putting a wedge between this country and the Soviet Union. So Stalin sent a very strong message that under no conditions was Czechoslovakia to accept the Marshall Plan, and it was to cease negotiations immediately. This was the beginning of the end of basically closing Czechoslovakia off to the West, because this then mobilized subsequent other actions, which included the resurrection or the erection of the Iron Curtain, which was partially mobilized under the narrative to protect the people of Czechoslovakia from the threat of the West, in this case also being the ideological threat from the West. So just completely severing contact from Europe. Of course, we also know that the Iron Curtain was erected because the Communist Party was actually very much, and this is more in the future, very much embarrassed of all the people that were defecting from the territory to go into the free world to seek a better life. So in order to stall this flooding out of key human capital, and in order to stop the embarrassment that this action caused, the Iron Curtain was also erected for those reasons.
So just to add to the rejection of the Marshall Plan by Czechoslovakia, where the Communist Party, in coordination with Moscow, really pull all its weight into changing the course that Czechoslovakia was beginning to take, and that was towards Marshall Plan and it was towards the West. As well as that, what happened in 1947 was that Czechoslovakia experienced unusually cold winters and dry summers, and that resulted in poor harvest. And this is just 2 years, not even, after the end of the Second World War. People still remember what it was like to starve, what it was like not to have enough to eat. So there was a lot of fear and a very real threat of a nationwide famine as a result of the bad weather and the poor harvest. So Czechoslovakia turned to the America for help, but because there was that rejection of Marshall Plan that happened just shortly before that, the US refused to help, and this is where the Soviet Union stepped in, very eager to help and save Czechoslovakia. And Czechoslovakia in that year sealed a fated grain deal with Moscow, which kind of strengthened, the alliance between the two countries, and even increased the power and the influence of the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia, and strengthened its appeal because it was them who negotiated the deal that saved the nation from starving. So moving forward into February of 1948. So from 1946 to 1948, the Communist Party was busy preparing all the necessities to be able to one day take total power in Czechoslovakia. In this, they were supported and advised by Moscow. But it was expected that the next opportunity will arise with the next general election. But that scenario didn't manifest. Instead came the year 1948, when in winter, 12 key ministers from the Democratic Party gave in or submitted their resignations. They did so to protest against the undemocratic activities of the Communist Party within the Ministry of Interior, because of course they knew what was going on. There was a huge concern among Czechoslovak politicians as to the activities of the communists, and also an awareness that this party would not hesitate to resort to violence in order to have their way. So the government tried to prevent it in this strategic move, where 12 ministers resigned, and the president, Benes, he was expected to turn the resignations down, and that would send a strong, albeit silent signal to the republic that the president, the head of the state, the right hand of the founder, Tomáš Garrigue-Masaryk, was not supporting the communists. But the situation was messy at the time. The president was sick. He was informed of the activities of the communists regarding arming civilians and creating people's militias. There was tension in the country, and what he didn't want to risk to spark a civil conflict, to spark a war, just a few short years after Second World War ended. So in a very surprising move, probably even surprised the Communist Party, the president signed the resignations. That meant that the government that was democratically elected into power in 1946 was dissolved, and the power to govern the country was given to the strongest party, and that was the Communist Party and its leader, Klement Gottwald. They were to make sure that the country would stabilize itself, and they were to prepare an early parliamentary election, but that never happened. Because as soon as those events were underway, the communists did not hesitate to use the opportunity to impose themselves and to take power in a bloodless coup. In those days, masses of workers went out into street to support the Communist Party. In the days just before all of that happened, a great shipment of machine guns and rifles arrived in Prague for the militiamen in case the Communist Party needed their support. So everything really was put in place, and the stage was ready for the grand move that sealed the fate of Czechoslovakia for the next 41 years. So it was in February 1948 that the Communist Party took power. The national borders of Czechoslovakia were closed, and the party would go on to rule for 4 decades. And this was a direct result of what happened in those democratic elections of 1946. And with that, we're closing this brief intro into the era. If you are interested in exploring the theme and the history more, I would like to suggest our book, Czechoslovakia Behind the Iron Curtain, to you, where you'll find an elaborate and an objective look or an insight into the communist history of Czechoslovakia, as well as stories of ordinary people and accounts of what it was like to live behind the Iron Curtain for all this time. And if you'd like to dive more into your Slovak heritage beyond the history of communism, we ran Global Slovakia Academy, which offers an interactive online courses that guide you through Slovak history, traditions, customs, foods, song, dance, etc. And this is a material that's normally very difficult to access because much of it is mostly in English, in Slovak. So we took all that, we digested it, and we designed these easy to access and easy to process courses for you.
And also, just to add to that, we're as part of our Global Slovakia Academy initiative, we're going to be launching a communism course in the next month or two, where we're going to dive dive into this topic very systematically, borrowing from materials from our book, but also other sources. We find that one of the best ways to learn about the era is actually through the audiovisual materials that are available also on the internet and on YouTube. So we're going to be pulling various clips, whether that's of the Cotswolds inauguration after the communist coup, where 100,000 plus people came to greet him, or whether that's footage from the Velvet Revolution, the succession of public gatherings across public squares in Czechoslovakia that eventually led to the dissolution of this regime 41 years later. That's all going to be in the course.
And with that, we would like to thank you for your time and your attention, and we hope to connect with you again soon at some point in the future.